My daughter and her husband sold my $3.2 million ranch without permission. When he handed me $16,000 and said, "Go die somewhere else," I burst out laughing. The look on their faces when they found out what was buried there was priceless. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Now let me tell you how we got to this moment. Because, honey, this story is wilder than anything you'd see on daytime television. My name is Evelyn Carter, but everyone calls me Evie. I'm 68 years old, and 3 days ago I discovered that my daughter Holly and her husband Ryan had somehow managed to sell my ranch in Wyoming without my knowledge or signature. The same ranch I'd owned for years. The same ranch where I'd buried my husband George after his funeral in 2018. Well, not literally buried him there. That would be illegal. And I'm many things, but stupid isn't one of them. I was sitting in my kitchen Tuesday morning, enjoying my coffee and working on a crossword puzzle when Ryan walked through my front door like he owned the place, which apparently he thought he did. "Morning, Evie," he said, not bothering to knock or even call ahead. His hair was slicked back with enough gel to lubricate a car engine, and he was wearing that smug expression he reserved for what he considered his greatest victories. "Ryan?" I said, not looking up from my puzzle. 7 letters for untrustworthy. I had a feeling the answer was right in front of me. He pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "We need to talk. Do we?" I sat down my pencil and finally looked at him. Ryan Miller was one of those men who thought an expensive suit could hide the fact that he had the moral backbone of a chocolate. "What about—" He slid an envelope across my kitchen table. "The ranch has been sold. Here's your cut." I stared at the envelope like he just handed me a dead fish. "My cut, $16,000? He said, his chest puffing out like a rooster who'd just learned to crow. "After expenses and commissions." "Of course." That's when I started laughing. I laughed so hard I had to wipe tears from my eyes. Ryan's confident expression wavered like a candle in a hurricane. "Something funny?" he asked, his voice tighter. "Now." "Oh, Ryan," I managed between giggles. "You have no idea what you've just done." His face darkened. "Look, Evie, you're getting older. Holly and I decided it was time to liquidate some assets and get you into a nice, assisted living facility somewhere with activities and people your own age." "How thoughtful," I said, my laughter fading to a smile that would have made a shark nervous. "And you did this? How exactly? Last I checked, my name was on that deed." Ryan waved his hand dismissively. "Holly has power of attorney. All perfectly legal. That was news to me. Does she now?" "The papers were filed 6 months ago when you had that dizzy spell." "Doctor's orders for your own protection." He stood up, straightening his tie. "The new owners take possession next week. You might want to start packing." After he left, I sat there staring at that envelope. $16,000 for a ranch worth $3.2 million. Even if Holly somehow had legal authority to sell, which I seriously doubted, this was highway robbery. But here's the thing about being 68 years old and having survived everything life could throw at me. You learn that sometimes the best revenge is simply knowing something your enemies don't. And Ryan Miller had no idea what he just sold. The law office of Ethan Brooks and Associates smelled like leather and false promises. I sat across from Ethan Brooks, a lawyer who looked young enough to be checking IDs at a bar, trying not to roll my eyes as he explained my limited options. "Mrs. Carter, I have to be honest with you," he said, shuffling through papers like he was dealing cards. "If your daughter does have power of attorney and acted within her legal authority, that's a big if." I interrupted. "I never signed any power of attorney papers." "Well, if you were experiencing cognitive issues at the time, you might not remember, son," I said, leaning forward. "I may be 68, but I remember every detail of every day for the past 6 months, including the fact that I never had any dizzy spell requiring medical attention." He cleared his throat nervously. Even so, proving fraud would require what it would require. I said, standing up and gathering my purse is a lawyer who believes his client. Clearly, you're not that lawyer. I walked out, leaving young Ethan Brooks with his mouth hanging open like a screen door in a tornado. Back in my car, I called my old friend Barbara from my book club. Barbara had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring, and she had the kind of practical legal knowledge that didn't come from law school. "Evie, honey, what's wrong?" She answered on the second ring. I explained the situation while driving home. Barbara's outrage was satisfying, but her advice was even better. "You need Linda Chen at Chen & Associates. She said she specializes in elder fraud, and she doesn't lose. But more importantly, Evie, you need to start gathering evidence. Get copies of everything. The sale documents, the power of attorney paperwork, bank records, everything already on it," I said. Ryan left the envelope with the sale paperwork. Amateur mistake. That afternoon, I spread the documents across my dining room table like I was planning a military campaign. The sale had gone through Pinnacle Real Estate, handled by an agent named Samantha Reed. The buyers were listed as Summit Ridge Development, LLC. Interesting. Ryan had told me it was a family looking for a private retreat. Corporate buyers usually meant development plans, shopping centers, housing developments, that sort of thing. I called Pinnacle Real Estate. "Samantha Reed speaking." "Hello, this is Evelyn Carter. I understand you recently handled the sale of my ranch on Aspen Creek Road." There was a pause. "Oh, Mrs. Carter. Yes, congratulations on the sale. Your daughter and son-in-law were so excited about helping you downsize. I'm sure they were. Can you tell me a bit about the buyer's Summit Ridge development? They're planning something wonderful, a luxury resort and spa. Your property was perfect for their needs. A luxury resort on my land where I'd spent 37 years building a life." "The sale went through very quickly," I said, casually. "Oh yes, they paid cash. $3.2 million. Such a relief when deals close that smoothly. $3.2 million. Ryan had handed me $16,000. After I hung up, I sat in my rocking chair on the front porch, looking out at the mountains that had been my view for decades. The anger was building inside me like a storm system. But underneath it was something else, something Ryan and Holly had clearly forgotten about. I wasn't just some helpless old lady they could push around. I was Evelyn Carter, who had taught high school English for 35 years, who had dealt with teenage troublemakers, overprotective parents, and incompetent administrators, who had buried a husband and raised a daughter largely on my own, and who knew exactly what was buried in the southwest corner of my property, under the old oak tree where George used to sit and read his newspaper. Ryan thought he was so clever, but he had no idea he'd just sold evidence that could destroy some very powerful people, evidence I'd kept hidden for 7 years, waiting for the right moment. That moment had just arrived. Linda Chen's office was everything Ethan Brooks's wasn't. Efficient, organized, and occupied by someone who actually listened when I spoke. Linda Chen was probably in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd heard every sob story and seen every scam. "Mrs. Carter, I've reviewed the documents you provided," she said, setting down a thick folder. "The power of attorney paperwork is questionable at best. The signatures don't match your usual handwriting, and there's no medical documentation supporting cognitive impairment because there wasn't any cognitive impairment," I said. "I was as sharp 6 months ago as I am right now." "I believe you. The question is, can we prove fraud before the sale becomes final?" I leaned back in my chair, considering how much to tell her. Linda Chen. What would happen if it turned out the property contained something that made it legally impossible to sell? Her eyebrows rose. What kind of something? Hypothetically, if there were environmental issues or historical artifacts or... I paused, choosing my words carefully. Evidence related to ongoing legal matters. Linda Chen set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Carter, is there something on that property that your daughter and son-in-law don't know about? Let's just say that when my husband George died 7 years ago, He left behind more than just memories. I'm going to need specifics if you want me to help you. I stared out her office window, watching people hurry by on the sidewalk below. People with their own secrets, their own buried truths. Finally, I made my decision. My husband worked for the County Planning Commission for 28 years. I began. He reviewed development applications, zoning requests, environmental impact studies, boring stuff, mostly. Mostly in 2015, he discovered that several major developments had been approved despite environmental violations. Wetlands destroyed protected wildlife habitats, cleared water sources, contaminated, all because the right people got paid off. Linda Chen's pen was moving rapidly across her legal pad. He had evidence photos, documents, recorded phone conversations, bank records showing payments to public officials. George was preparing to turn everything over to the FBI when he had his heart attack. What happened to the evidence? I smiled for the first time since walking into her office. I buried it in a waterproof container under the oak tree on the southwest corner of my property. Been there for 7 years waiting. Mrs. Carter, are you telling me that your ranch is sitting on evidence of public corruption? I'm telling you that Summit Ridge Development LLC is one of the companies George was investigating. And if they're planning to build a resort on my land, they're going to get quite a surprise when they start digging. Linda Chen leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Mrs. Carter, I think we're going to get along just fine. We spent the next hour developing a strategy. Linda Chen would file an injunction to stop the sale, claiming fraudulent power of attorney. Meanwhile, I would contact the FBI about the buried evidence. There's just one problem, Linda Chen said as I was gathering my things. If we reveal the evidence too early, your daughter and son-in-law might claim ignorance. We need to catch them in the act of trying to cover it up. Don't worry about that, I said, standing up. Holly and Ryan think they're so much smarter than the old lady. They'll try to fix this quietly, and when they do, we'll have them exactly where we want them. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Ryan had walked into my kitchen with his envelope of blood money, I had a plan. But first, I needed to make a phone call to an old friend at the FBI. Agent Rachel Morgan had been George's contact during his investigation. She'd been waiting 7 years for George's evidence to surface. It was time to make some people very, very nervous. Agent Rachel Morgan looked exactly the same as she had 7 years ago. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen enough corruption to fill a library. We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from prying eyes and curious ears. Evie, I have to admit, when you called, I thought you might finally be ready to hand over George's evidence, she said, stirring her coffee. I didn't expect to hear it was accidentally sold with your ranch. Life has a sense of humor, I said. The question is, how do we handle this without spooking the development company? Rachel pulled out a tablet and showed me a screen full of corporate information. Summit Ridge Development LLC is owned by William Hayes Construction Enterprises. Ring any bells? My blood ran cold. William Hayes was the main target of George's investigation. Exactly. And Mr. Hayes has spent the last 7 years very carefully avoiding anything that might draw federal attention. He's been clean as a whistle, suspiciously clean until now. I said he just bought property containing evidence that could send him to federal prison. The question is, does he know what he bought? I considered this. Ryan and Holly certainly don't know. They think they're getting rich quick by selling their crazy mother's property. But Hayes... I paused, thinking. George always suspected someone warned Hayes about the investigation. That's why he hid the evidence instead of turning it in immediately. Rachel leaned forward. You think Hayes might know about the evidence? I think Hayes has been looking for it for 7 years, and now he thinks he owns the land where it's buried. We sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications. If Hayes knew about the evidence, this wasn't just about my ranch anymore. This was about a desperate man trying to bury his past. Literally. Here's what we're going to do, Rachel said finally. We're going to let the sale proceed, but under surveillance. If Hayes starts digging in suspicious places, we'll know he's looking for something specific. And if he finds it, he won't, because you're going to retrieve it first. I nearly choked on my coffee. I'm going to what, Evie? You're the only person who knows exactly where George buried that evidence. We need to get it before Hayes does, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't alert him to what we're doing. In case you've forgotten, I'm 68 years old. I'm not exactly built for midnight excavation projects. Rachel smiled. That's why you're going to have help. My partner, Agent David Torres, specializes in covert operations. He's also worked construction, so he knows how to dig quietly. The plan was insane, but it was also brilliant. I would go back to the ranch under the pretense of collecting personal items. Rachel's team would provide surveillance and support. We'd retrieve the evidence before Hayes's people found it. There's just one problem, I said. Holly and Ryan will be watching me like hawks. They'll suspect something if I start digging around the property. Leave that to me, Rachel said. I have an idea. 2 hours later, I was driving back to the ranch with a story prepared. I'd called Holly and told her I wanted to collect some of George's personal effects, specifically his toolbox, and the antique fishing tackle he'd kept in the garage, sentimental value I'd explained. Holly had grudgingly agreed to meet me there. What I hadn't told Holly was that George's toolbox contained a metal detector and a small shovel, or that his fishing tackle was actually surveying equipment he'd used to mark the exact location where he'd buried the evidence. As I pulled into the driveway of what had been my home for 37 years, I saw Holly's car already there. She was standing on the front porch, checking her phone and looking impatient. "Mom, hurry up," she called out. "I have a yoga class at 4:00. "Of course you do, sweetheart," I said, getting out of my car. "This won't take long." If only she knew how right she was. Holly followed me around the ranch like a suspicious guard dog, which would have been annoying if it wasn't so predictable. My daughter had always thought she was the clever one in the family, but she'd inherited her father's tendency to overthink simple situations. "Mom, why do you need all this old junk?" she asked, watching me load George's toolbox into my car. "It's just going to clutter up whatever apartment you end up in." "Sentimental value," I said, trying to look appropriately melancholy. "Your father spent hours with these tools fixing things around the property." What I didn't mention was that fixing things had included installing motion sensor cameras and a sophisticated alarm system that George had used to monitor his evidence cache. The control unit was hidden in what looked like an ordinary tackle box. "I still can't believe you're making such a big deal about this," Holly continued. "Ryan and I are trying to help you transition to a more manageable lifestyle." "How thoughtful," I said, hefting the tackle box. "Speaking of Ryan, where is he today? Meeting with the development company. They want to start surveying the property next week." Interesting. I wondered if Ryan had any idea who he was really dealing with. "Mom, can we please hurry this up?" Holly glanced at her Apple Watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "I really do have plans." "Of course, dear. Just one more thing." I walked toward the southwest corner of the property where the old oak tree cast long shadows across the ground. Holly trailed behind me, her designer heels sinking into the soft earth with each step. "Why are we going way out here?" she asked. "Your father's fishing chair," I said, pointing to an old aluminum chair that had indeed been George's favorite spot for reading the newspaper. "I want to keep it." What Holly didn't notice was me casually stepping off the distance from the tree to the large boulder George had used as a landmark, 15 Fouet northeast, just like he'd written in his notes. The evidence was buried 3 feet down in a case designed to survive decades underground. As I folded up the chair, I caught sight of a black SUV parked on the road about a mile away. Too far to see clearly, but I had a feeling it wasn't there by coincidence. "Okay, that's everything I said," starting back toward my car. "Thank you for your patience, Holly." Finally, she muttered, following me. "Mom, I hope you understand that Ryan and I are doing this for your own good. You can't live out here alone forever." I'm sure you believe that I said, loading the chair into my trunk. As we drove away in our separate cars, I watched Holly in my rearview mirror. She was already on her phone, probably calling Ryan to report that her crazy mother had collected some worthless junk and hadn't caused any trouble. If only she knew that her crazy mother had just completed the reconnaissance phase of an FBI operation. That evening, I met Agent David Torres at a diner 20 kilometers from town. David Torres was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with calloused hands and the kind of quiet competence that suggested he'd done this sort of thing before. Mrs. Carter, Agent Rachel Morgan briefed me on the situation, she said, sliding into the booth across from me. We'll go in tomorrow night, 2:00 a.m., in and out in 30 minutes. What about security? Your ranch doesn't have active security systems anymore. We checked, but the development company has started posting guards during the day. Night should be clear. I pulled out a hand-drawn map I'd created from George's notes. The cache is here 15 feet northeast of the oak tree. Metal container about the size of a briefcase buried 3 feet down. David studied the map. Access route. There's an old logging road that comes in from the north. It connects to the county road about a mile past the main entrance. George used it when he wanted to move around the property without being seen. Perfect. We'll park there and hike in. You'll stay in the vehicle with communications. I looked at him like he'd suggested I wait in orbit. Agent David Torres. I've been walking this property for 37 years. I know every rock, every tree, every gopher hole. You're going to need me to find that cache quickly and quietly. Mrs. Carter, with respect, this could be dangerous. If Hayes's people are watching the property, then you'll need someone who can move around without triggering every motion detector and camera they've installed. I interrupted. I helped George set up the original security system. I know how to avoid it. David looked uncertain, but I could see him weighing the practical benefits against his obvious concerns about bringing a 68-year-old civilian on a covert operation. Look, Agent Torres, I said, leaning forward. I taught high school for 35 years. I've dealt with teenage drug dealers, gang members, and administrators with the moral flexibility of rubber bands. A few corporate security guards don't scare me. He almost smiled at that. All right, Mrs. Carter, but we do this my way. Understood perfectly. As I drove home that night, I felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. Tomorrow night, I would finally finish what George had started, and Ryan and Holly would learn that their elderly mother was full of surprises, some of them pleasant, others not so much. The logging road was darker than I remembered, with tree branches scraping against David's surveillance van like skeletal fingers. I sat in the passenger seat, wearing black clothes that made me feel like I was auditioning for a very senior version of a spy movie. Radio check, David whispered into his headset. Alpha team in position. Rachel's voice crackled through the speaker. Copy, Alpha. No movement on primary surveillance. You're clear to proceed. David turned to me. Last chance to wait in the van. Mrs. Carter. Agent Torres, I've come this far. I'm not backing down now. We grabbed our equipment, David's professional excavation tools and my much more humble collection of garden implements, and headed into the darkness. I'd walked this path hundreds of times during daylight, but at 2 a.m., it felt like an entirely different landscape. Bear left at the fallen log, I whispered, pointing ahead. The oak tree should be visible in about 50 yards. David moved like a ghost, barely disturbing the undergrowth. I tried to match his stealth, though my 68-year-old joints weren't quite as cooperative as I would have liked. The oak tree loomed against the starlit sky, its massive trunk exactly as I remembered. I counted off 15 paces northeast and pointed to a spot near the large boulder. There, I whispered. David pulled out what looked like a high-tech metal detector and swept it over the area. Within seconds, it began beeping softly. Got it, he said. Metal object approximately 3 feet down, consistent with your description. He began digging with practice efficiency, removing dirt and careful layers to minimize disturbance. I kept watch, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. Mrs. Carter. David, I whispered, after about 10 minutes. I think I hit something. I crept closer and saw the corner of a metal case emerging from the dark earth. My heart pounded as David carefully cleared the dirt away, revealing a large waterproof container that had been George's insurance policy. There, I breathed. That's it. David lifted the case from the hole and quickly began filling it back in. Let's get out of here. But as we turned to head back to the van, I caught sight of headlights in the distance. A vehicle was coming up the main ranch road. David! I hissed, pointing toward the lights. He immediately pressed his radio. Alpha to base. We have incoming vehicle. ETA 2 minutes. Copy. Alpha. Can you reach extraction point? David looked at the distance we'd have to cover and shook his head. Negative. Too much open ground. The headlights were getting closer. In the darkness, I could make out at least 2 vehicles, moving slowly like they were searching for something. This way, I whispered, leading David toward a cluster of boulders near the creek. It wasn't perfect cover, but it would have to do. We crouched behind the rocks as the vehicles reached the oak tree area. Car doors slammed, and I heard voices carried on the night air. You sure this is the right spot? A man asked. GPS coordinates match. Another voice replied. Hayes was very specific about this location. My blood ran cold. Hayes's people were looking for the same cache we just retrieved. Start setting up the equipment, the first man ordered. Boss wants this done before sunrise. Through a gap in the rocks, I could see 3 men unloading what looked like excavation equipment. Serious stuff. Not the kind of tools you'd use for casual digging. David pressed his radio again. Base, we need immediate extraction. They're setting up to dig right where we just were. Copy. Alpha. Beta team, moving to secure alternate route. We waited in tense silence as Hayes's people began their search. They had metal detectors too, but they were sweeping in a grid pattern that would take them much longer to cover the same ground. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, David's radio crackled again. Alpha Beta team in position. Move north to secondary extraction point. We slipped away from our hiding spot and made our way carefully through the darkness. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of digging and increasingly frustrated voices, as Hayes's people realized they weren't finding what they'd expected. When we finally reached the van, I was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline and the satisfaction of knowing we'd beaten them to the prize. Mrs. Carter, David said as we drove away. That was some of the best covert maneuvering I've seen from a civilian. I told you, I said, patting the metal case beside me. High school was excellent training for dealing with criminal behavior. As we headed back to town, I thought about Ryan and Holly probably sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that their simple real estate scam was about to become the center of a federal investigation. Tomorrow, I would call Linda Chin and set the next phase of my plan in motion. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. George's evidence was finally safe, and Hayes's people were about to discover that sometimes the old lady wins. The contents of George's cache exceeded even my expectations. Spread across Linda Chen's conference table were documents, photographs, and recordings that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it would make front-page news for weeks. Mrs. Carter, this is extraordinary, Linda Chen said, examining a series of bank records. Your husband documented bribes totaling over $2 million. Rachel nodded grimly. And these phone recordings of Hayes discussing payoffs to county commissioners. This is exactly what we needed to build an airtight case. I picked up a photograph showing Hayes handing an envelope to County Commissioner Grant. George always said timing was everything in politics and poker. Speaking of timing, Rachel said, Hayes's people spent 6 hours digging last night before giving up. Our surveillance team reported they seemed increasingly agitated as the night went on. Any word on what Ryan and Holly know? I asked. Linda Chen consulted her notes. My sources at the courthouse say they filed an emergency motion this morning trying to expedite the sale closure. They're nervous about something. That afternoon, Ryan called me for the first time since delivering his insulting envelope. His voice had lost its usual smugness, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "Evie, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Do we?" I thought our conversation was finished when you handed me $16,000 for my $3.2 million ranch. Look, there might be some complications with the sale. The buyers are asking questions about the property history. What kind of questions? There was a pause. Environmental stuff, previous land use, whether there might be any surprises buried on the property. I almost laughed. Surprises, Ryan? I lived there for 37 years. What kind of surprises could there be? That's what I told them, but they seemed to think. He stopped clearly, struggling with how much to reveal. They want to do some exploratory digging before finalizing the purchase, and Holly and I were hoping you might know if George ever buried anything on the property. Old septic systems, farm equipment, anything like that. Now I did laugh. Oh, Ryan, you have no idea how deep a hole you've dug for yourself. What's that supposed to mean? It means you should have asked these questions before forging my signature on legal documents. The line went quiet. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the fact that I never signed any power of attorney papers, Ryan. I'm talking about fraud. Evie, you need to be very careful about making accusations. Or what? You'll steal more of my property. I hung up before he could respond. Within an hour, Holly was calling, her voice shrill with panic. Mom, what did you say to Ryan? He's talking about lawyer fees and criminal charges. I told him the truth, Holly. Something you two might want to consider trying. Mom, please, we can fix this. We can work something out. The time for working something out was before you decided to treat me like a senile old woman who could be discarded. We never meant. You meant exactly what you did. The question now is what you're going to do about it. After I hung up on Holly too, I called Linda Chen. They're panicking. Hayes must be putting pressure on them to resolve whatever problems his people discovered. Good. Panicked people make mistakes. What's our next move? We let them panic a little more. Tomorrow, I'm filing criminal charges for elder fraud and forgery. Once that's public record, Hayes will realize he's been dealing with criminals who couldn't deliver what they promised. That evening, I sat in my temporary apartment looking through the evidence we'd recovered. George had been meticulous in his documentation, but one file surprised me. It contained information about Ryan's construction company, specifically about a development project that had been built on illegally filled wetlands. Ryan hadn't just stumbled into this mess by accident. He'd been involved in Hayes's corruption network for years. My phone rang. Unknown number. Mrs. Carter. The voice was unfamiliar. Growly. My name is James Hayes. I think we need to have a conversation. Every instinct told me to hang up, but curiosity won. Mr. Hayes, I understand you've purchased my ranch. There seems to be some confusion about that purchase. I'm hoping we can resolve it like civilized people. I'm always in favor of civilized conversation. Excellent. Would you be available to meet tomorrow afternoon? I have some questions about your property. I'm sure you do. What time? After we arranged to meet at a restaurant downtown, I immediately called Rachel. Hayes wants to meet with me directly. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Rachel, this might be our only chance to get him to incriminate himself. If he's desperate enough to contact me directly, he's going to say something stupid. And if he's desperate enough to hurt you, then you'll have him for assault on top of everything else. Besides, we'll meet in a public place. I'll wear a wire. There was a long pause. Evie. You realize this isn't a game, right? Hayes has already killed to protect his secrets. What do you mean? 3 people who worked on George's original investigation died in accidents over the past 7 years. Car crashes, construction accidents, a house fire, all ruled accidental. But the implications hit me like a physical blow. You think Hayes had them killed? I think Hayes is a very dangerous man who's running out of options. That night, I lay awake thinking about George, about the risks he'd taken, to expose the truth about the courage it had taken to bury that evidence, instead of turning it in, immediately knowing it might be needed someday. Tomorrow, I would face the man who might have killed my husband's sources. The man who thought he could intimidate a 68-year-old woman into giving up everything she'd worked for. He was about to learn that some old ladies don't intimidate easily. The restaurant Hayes chose was the kind of place where powerful men made deals they didn't want recorded. Dark wood paneling, thick carpets that absorbed sound, and tables spaced far enough apart for private conversations. I arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to observe Hayes before he saw me. Rachel's surveillance team was positioned around the restaurant, and I wore a wire that was so sophisticated it looked like a hearing aid. Hayes walked in exactly on time, and I recognized him immediately from George's surveillance photos. He was smaller than I'd expected, with the kind of soft build that suggested too many business lunches, but his eyes had the calculating coldness of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Mrs. Carter," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Mr. Hayes. I have to admit, I'm curious about what brings a busy developer to seek out a retired teacher." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think we have a mutual problem that requires a creative solution." "Do we?" "Your daughter and son-in-law led me to believe they had clear title to your ranch. It seems that may not be the case." I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue. "I've invested considerable resources in acquiring that property for a specific development project. Now I'm hearing about potential legal challenges. That must be frustrating. It is, particularly since my geological surveys suggest there may be complications on the property." "What kind of complications?" Hayes leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, let's speak plainly. I have reason to believe your late husband may have buried certain materials on your ranch. Materials that could prove embarrassing to various parties. Embarrassing, damaging, potentially catastrophic." The waiter appeared to take our lunch orders. Hayes ordered the salmon. I chose the soup, figuring I might need to leave quickly. "Mr. Hayes," I said once we were alone again, "are you suggesting my husband was involved in something illegal?" "I'm suggesting your husband was a man who collected information. Information that certain people would pay handsomely to recover." "How handsomely? $2 million cash for the exact location of whatever your husband buried." I almost choked on my coffee. $2 million. Plus, of course, we'd resolved the legal issues with your ranch sale. Everyone walks away happy. "And if I don't know where anything is buried?" Hayes's expression hardened. "Mrs. Carter, I've done my research. Your husband was methodical, careful. He wouldn't have hidden something that important without telling his wife where to find it. You seem to know a lot about my husband's habits." I knew George personally. We had several conversations over the years. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. What kind of conversations? The kind where I tried to convince him that some secrets are better left buried. Unfortunately, George was idealistic. He believed in justice over practicality. Our food arrived, giving me time to process the implication. Hayes was admitting he'd known about George's investigation all along. "Mr. Hayes, are you threatening me? I'm offering you a business proposition. $2 million for information that frankly isn't worth the paper it's printed on anymore. The people involved have moved on. Retired, died of natural causes. There's no point in dredging up ancient history. Ancient history that's worth $2 million to you." He set down his fork and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to be very clear. I need that information. I'm willing to pay for it, but I'm also willing to pursue other options if necessary." "Other options?" "Your daughter and son-in-law have committed several felonies in the course of this transaction. Forgery, fraud, elder abuse. I could ensure those charges disappear, or I could ensure they stick. Your choice." The threat was crystal clear. Hayes was willing to sacrifice Ryan and Holly to get what he wanted. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Of course, but not too much time. My development schedule is very tight." As Hayes left the restaurant, I sat there feeling sick. Not from fear, but from rage. This man had terrorized my husband for years, possibly murdered his colleagues, and now thought he could blackmail me using my own daughter. I pulled out my phone and called Linda Chen. "We need to accelerate our timeline. What happened?" Hayes just confessed to knowing about George's investigation, and he threatened Ryan and Holly. "Evie, that's perfect. We have him on tape threatening you. We have him being careful with his words. But Linda, there's something else. He offered me $2 million for information about where George buried his evidence. $2 million. That means the evidence is worth far more than we thought." That afternoon, Rachel and I reviewed the recording. Hayes had been skillful in his phrasing, never directly admitting to crimes but making his intentions clear. "It's enough to bring him in for questioning," Rachel said. "But it's not enough to convict him. What do we need? We need him to do something desperate, something that proves he's willing to commit crimes to get that evidence." I thought about Ryan and Holly panicking in their expensive house, realizing they'd been played by professionals. About Hayes probably planning his next move. "I have an idea," I said, "but you're not going to like it." "Why do I already know I'm not going to like it? Because it involves me going back to the ranch." "Absolutely not," Rachel said for the third time. "We're not using you as bait, Rachel. Think about it. Hayes believes I know where the evidence is buried. If I go back to the ranch, he'll follow me. And when he does, we'll have him for trespassing, attempted theft, and whatever else he tries." We were sitting in the FBI field office surrounded by surveillance photos and case files. Linda had joined us, and she looked as skeptical as Rachel did. "Evie, Hayes has killed people," Linda said. 3 people that we know of allegedly killed people. And besides, he's not going to hurt me if he thinks I'm leading him to what he wants. And what happens when you don't produce any evidence?" I smiled. "Who says I won't?" Rachel leaned forward. "What are you talking about? George was thorough. Remember? He didn't just bury 1 cache. He buried 3. The room went quiet. The main evidence cache was what we recovered the other night, but George also buried backup copies in 2 other locations on the property. Insurance policies, and you know where they are. Of course, George didn't trust anyone completely except me. Linda was making notes rapidly. "So, you're proposing to lead Hayes to one of the backup sites?" "Exactly. We set up surveillance. Let him think he's about to get what he wants. Then arrest him in the act of attempting to steal evidence in a federal investigation." Rachel shook her head. "There are too many variables. What if he brings armed men? What if he decides to eliminate you after he gets the evidence? Then you'll have him for attempted murder too." "Rachel, we need to end this. Hayes isn't going to give up, and he's already threatening Ryan and Holly. If we don't stop him now, someone is going to get hurt." After 2 hours of arguing, they finally agreed to a modified version of my plan. I would call Hayes and tell him I'd found something George had left behind, a map showing where he'd buried important documents. I would offer to trade the location for immunity for Ryan and Holly. "But we do this with a full tactical team," Rachel insisted. "And the moment things go sideways, you get out of there. Understood?" That evening, I called Hayes from my apartment. He answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Carter, I was hoping to hear from you. I've been thinking about our conversation." "Mr. Hayes, I may have something you're interested in. I'm listening." "After you left, I went through some of George's old papers. I found a hand-drawn map showing where he buried what he called his insurance policy." There was a pause. "What exactly does this map show?" "GPS coordinates, depth measurements, a detailed description of what's buried and where. And you're willing to share this information for the right price and a guarantee that my daughter and son-in-law won't face criminal charges." "Of course. When can we meet tomorrow night at the ranch?" "Midnight. Why the ranch?" "Because I want to verify the location before I hand over the map. Make sure I'm giving you accurate information." Hayes agreed, though I could hear the suspicion in his voice. That was fine. Suspicious people made more mistakes. The next day, Rachel's team set up surveillance around the ranch. Infrared cameras, motion detectors, and sharpshooters positioned at strategic points around the property. Remember, Rachel told me through my earpiece, you're never more than 50 yards from backup. The code word is insurance. If you say that word, we move in immediately. At 11:45 p.m., I drove up to the ranch in my old Honda, feeling more nervous than I wanted to admit. The property looked different in the darkness, more menacing than the home I'd loved for 37 years. Hayes's black SUV was already there, parked near the main house. I saw at least 2 other vehicles nearby, which meant he'd brought backup. As I got out of my car, Hayes emerged from the shadows with 2 men I didn't recognize. Both were large, quiet, and moved like they'd done this sort of thing before. Mrs. Carter Hayes said, "I appreciate your punctuality." "Mr. Hayes, I hope you appreciate mine." The map. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket. GPS coordinates for 3 different burial sites. George was apparently more paranoid than I realized. Hayes studied the map by flashlight. "These locations are all on the southwest section of the property. George always said that was the most secluded area. Less chance of accidental discovery, and you're certain this information is accurate. There's only one way to find out." Hayes nodded to his men, and we began walking toward the coordinates I'd marked on the fake map. What Hayes didn't know was that I was leading him directly into the FBI's surveillance zone. As we reached the first location, Hayes's men began setting up excavation equipment, professional stuff, the kind used for construction projects. "This seems like a lot of preparation for a simple excavation," I observed. "Mrs. Carter, when you're dealing with potentially explosive information, it pays to be thorough." That's when I realized Hayes planned to dig up everything tonight. Not just verify the location, but recover all the evidence immediately and probably eliminate the only witness who knew where it was buried. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly into my hidden microphone. "Mr. Hayes, I hope you brought adequate insurance for this operation." The code word was out. Now I just had to stay alive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. The FBI tactical team moved like ghosts through the darkness. One moment, Hayes and his men were setting up their equipment. The next, they were surrounded by federal agents with automatic weapons. "FBI, nobody move." Hayes's men immediately dropped their shovels and raised their hands. But Hayes himself seemed almost relieved, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, even with 3 red laser dots dancing on his chest. "You've been busy." 7 years, Mr. Hayes. I've had 7 years to plan this moment." Agent Rachel stepped into the circle of light cast by the excavation equipment. "James Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and attempted theft of evidence in a federal investigation." As the agents cuffed Hayes and his men, he looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Your husband would be proud." "My husband is the reason you're going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison." But Hayes smiled. "Mrs. Carter, I think you'll find this story is far from over." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've been assuming I was the top of the food chain. You're about to discover how wrong you were." The next morning, the story exploded across every news outlet in the state. "FBI arrests developer and corruption scandal" was the headline in the morning paper, accompanied by photos of Hayes being led away in handcuffs. But it was the second story that caught my attention. Local couple arrested in elder fraud scheme. Ryan and Holly had been picked up at their house at dawn. According to the article, they were being charged with forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Their bail had been set at $500,000 each. Linda Chen called me while I was reading the paper. "Evie, we need to talk. Hayes's lawyer is claiming his client is willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges." "Cooperate how?" "He says Ryan Patterson has been laundering money for a network of corrupt officials for the past 5 years. That the ranch sale was just one part of a larger scheme." I felt sick. How large? According to Hayes, Ryan's been handling millions of dollars in illegal payments. The ranch money was supposed to be used to pay off a federal judge who was about to rule on a case that could have exposed the entire network. A federal judge, Judge Harrison Wickham. He's been on the federal bench for 15 years, and apparently he's been taking bribes for most of that time. The name meant nothing to me, but the implications were staggering. This wasn't just about local corruption anymore. This was about a network that reached into the federal court system. Linda, what does this mean for Ryan and Holly? It means they're in far more trouble than we originally thought. But it also means they might be willing to cooperate if it keeps them out of federal prison. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to Ryan and Holly's house. The place looked different now, smaller, somehow less impressive. The expensive cars were gone, probably seized by the FBI. The manicured lawn was already showing signs of neglect. Holly answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, her usual designer wardrobe nowhere in evidence. She looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Holly, I suppose you've come to gloat. I've come to talk." She led me into the living room where Ryan sat hunched over a laptop, probably trying to figure out how to pay for lawyers they couldn't afford. "Ryan," I said. He looked up, and I was shocked by the change in him. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who'd realized he was completely out of his depth. "Evie, I want you to know." "Stop," I said. "Before you say anything, you should know that everything you say to me might end up being used in court." They both stared at me. "The FBI offered me a deal," I continued. "If I can convince you two to cooperate fully with their investigation, they'll recommend reduced charges." "What kind of reduced charges?" Ryan asked. "Instead of 10 to 15 years in federal prison, you might be looking at 2 to 3 years plus restitution." Holly started crying. "Mom, we're so sorry. We never meant for it to go this far." "Holly, the time for apologies was before you forged my signature. What I need to know now is whether you're willing to tell the FBI everything you know about Hayes' operation." Ryan closed his laptop. "Evie, if I cooperate, these people will kill me. You don't understand who we're dealing with." "I understand perfectly, Ryan, but you have two choices. Help the FBI or spend the rest of your life in prison while the real criminals go free." I spent an hour explaining what the FBI had discovered, watching their faces as they realized how completely they'd been manipulated by Hayes and his associates. "The ranch sale was never about getting you money," I said finally. "It was about getting Hayes access to George's evidence. You were just tools, but we needed that money." Holly said Ryan's business was failing and we had debts. "And instead of asking for help, you decided to steal from me." The room went quiet. "Mom," Holly said finally, "if we cooperate, if we tell them everything, can you ever forgive us?" I looked at my daughter, remembering the little girl who used to help me plant flowers in the garden, who brought me dandelions and called them the most beautiful flowers in the world. "Holly, forgiveness isn't something you earn by cooperating with the FBI. But it might be something you earn by spending the next few years proving you understand the difference between right and wrong." That evening, Ryan and Holly met with Agent Rachel and agreed to full cooperation. Within hours, the FBI had enough information to arrest 6 more people, including Judge Wickham and 2 county commissioners. But as I watched the news coverage of the expanding investigation, I couldn't shake Hayes' words. This story is far from over. Something told me he was right. The final revelation came 3 weeks later during what was supposed to be a routine meeting with Agent Rachel. Rachel had called me to her office to review my testimony for the upcoming trials, but her expression suggested something more significant. "Evie, we've been analyzing the financial records Ryan provided," she began. "We've uncovered something that changes everything." "What kind of something?" Rachel pulled out a thick folder. Judge Wickham wasn't just taking bribes. He was the central coordinator for the entire corruption network. Every major development project in the region for the past 15 years went through his court for environmental approval zoning disputes or contract enforcement, and he made sure the right people won. Exactly. But here's the part that's going to shock you. The network didn't start with Hayes. It started with your husband's boss at the county planning office. My blood ran cold. Commissioner Davidson, Georgia's direct supervisor for 28 years, the man who assigned him to review all those development applications. I sank into my chair as the implications hit me. George wasn't investigating corruption. He was being used to provide it. Davidson was feeding George false environmental reports, manipulated surveys, doctored financial statements. Every development George approved was based on fraudulent information Davidson provided, but George discovered the truth. Eventually, that's when he started his real investigation, documenting how Davidson and his network were using the planning office to facilitate illegal development projects. Rachel pulled out another document, but here's the part that ties everything together. Davidson died 2 years ago in a car accident. The day before, he was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury. You think they killed him? I think Davidson knew too much and was about to talk just like George would have if he'd lived long enough. The room was spinning. George hadn't just been investigating corruption. He'd been a victim of it for years. He'd unknowingly facilitated the very crimes he eventually died trying to expose. Rachel, there's something I need to tell you about George's death. What about it? He didn't die of a natural heart attack. Rachel leaned forward. What do you mean? The night before he died, George told me he was going to contact the FBI the next morning. He had everything ready. Documents, recordings, financial records. He was finally going to turn it all in. And he went to bed that night, perfectly healthy, excited even. He said he felt like a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. Evie, what are you saying? I'm saying George was murdered, and I've been carrying that knowledge for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to prove it. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small vial containing a white powder. What is that digitalis? I found it in George's coffee cup the morning after he died. I had it tested by a private lab, but I never told anyone because I knew whoever killed him was still out there. Rachel stared at the vial. Digitalis causes heart failure that's virtually undetectable without specific testing. And since George had no history of heart problems, no one thought to look for it. Why didn't you come forward before now? Because I knew George's killer was someone with access to our house. Someone he trusted enough to accept a cup of coffee from. Someone who knew about his investigation. Davidson. Davidson visited our house the night George died. He said he wanted to discuss the next day's testimony, coordinate their stories. I made coffee, then went to bed early. When I woke up, George was dead. Rachel was already reaching for her phone. We need to exhume Davidson's body test for similar compounds. If he was murdered too, his killer might have used the same method. 2 days later, the forensic results confirmed what I'd suspected for 7 years. Davidson's remains showed evidence of the same digitalis compound that had killed George. But the biggest surprise came when the FBI traced the source of the poison. It had been purchased by Judge Wickham's wife, a retired pharmacist who had access to medical-grade compounds. Mrs. Wickham has agreed to cooperate. Agent Rachel told me she says her husband forced her to provide the poison, threatening to implicate her in the corruption scheme if she refused. So Wickham killed both George and Davidson, and probably the 3 other potential witnesses who died in accidents over the past 7 years. Mrs. Wickham kept detailed records of every compound she provided. We can now connect Wickham to 5 murders. The final arrests made national news. Judge Harrison Wickham charged with 5 counts of murder and leading a racketeering organization. His wife granted immunity in exchange for testimony. Hayes, and 12 other defendants facing charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy to commit murder. Ryan and Holly, as promised, received reduced sentences. 2 years each, plus restitution and community service. They would rebuild their lives, but they would do it with a clear understanding of what their choices had cost. As for me, I got my ranch back. The sale was voided due to fraud, and Mountain View Development LLC was dissolved. I decided to donate the property to the state as a nature preserve with one condition: a memorial garden for George and the other victims of the corruption network. 6 months after Hayes' arrest, I stood in that memorial garden watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Linda Chin had joined me for the dedication ceremony, along with Agent Rachel and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the corruption network. "Any regrets?" Linda asked. I thought about George, about the years he'd spent unknowingly facilitating the very corruption he died trying to expose. About Ryan and Holly learning hard lessons about the consequences of greed. About the 5 people who died because they threatened to expose the truth. "No regrets," I said finally. Justice took 7 years, but it finally arrived. As the stars came out over the ranch that was no longer mine, but would forever be home, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. George's evidence had finally served its purpose. The truth had won. And sometimes, and that's enough, the old lady had gotten the last laugh after all. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.